This episode is sponsored by ShoutOUT, a two-way text messaging and campaign management platform that provides analytics and facilitates conversational messaging that delivers, engages, and converts more. Send personalized campaigns from unique phone numbers to the message content itself, letting you brand your campaign to promote yourself and create your messages in a way that users are made to think you sent it personally for them. You can then monitor and improve your campaigns over time with real-time analytics. Start reducing messaging and campaign costs with cost-effective bulk SMS. Scale efficiently without having to worry about high costs. If you'd like to start using mass texting services with simple packages to choose from, visit getshoutout.com today. Hello, everyone. This is your host, Akil Jabbar, and welcome back to another episode of SaaS District. In today's episode, we'll be talking about how to avoid common mistakes that US SaaS businesses make when expanding into Europe. Today, we have our guest, Alan Gleeson, joining us. Alan is the founder of Work with Agility, which is a strategic B2B marketing consultancy with a passion for supporting tech startups to generate leads and to grow their businesses. Alan started his career in financial services, joining Barclays on their graduate program. He then joined Palo Alto Software, which was a leading SaaS company in 2004, where he acted as the managing director for the European subsidiary for a number of years. So more recently, Alan has worked for a number of leading SaaS startups in a mix of full-time and consultancy engagement. So welcome, Alan. Super excited to have you on the SaaS District show today.
Thanks so much, Akil. Delighted to be on and looking forward to chatting.
Awesome. So I want to get into, because a lot of the, listeners who are listening today are probably based, I think most of our demographic is actually based out of the US, SaaS founders, and a lot of their audience of who they target, their largest market is obviously the USA. But then there's that notion of thinking, in their roadmap, if they want expansion, once they find product market fit, they want to go into a different market. What should be some, if you can share, what are some things that SaaS founders should be thinking about and planning if they're thinking about expanding internationally and specifically into the European market versus, just in the US?
Yeah, look, a great question. I mean, the first thing with SaaS, right, is there may not be a kind of a juncture in the road where you decide you expand into countries because, of course, you might be winning business from the get-go from around the world, right? Because the whole point of it is it's a SaaS application, right? So you can have users from different countries. I guess what starts happening, though, is as you go on your sort of scale-up journey, many B2B SaaS companies will be VC-backed, right? So there'll definitely be pressure and questions asked to the kind of senior exec around growth potential and sort of, all of a sudden Europe becomes interesting as a secondary market to start looking for growth opportunities. And of course, Europe is unlike America, right? Where if you pick North America and take US and Canada, you got 300 million in a fairly homogenous sort of unit, whereas Europe is very fragmented, which I guess is the first thing that people aren't always aware of, whereby, there's many different languages. The different countries have different currencies. There's different population pools. So it's a very different sort of landscape. So I guess it is probably the second biggest market out of in SaaS after US. And then when you start looking at for countries, you've probably got UK as number 2 and Germany starts cropping up. But then you find that there's weak demand from many countries in Europe. So there are some of the kind of characteristics that are different.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we're doing that. One of our the companies we work with, started in the US, recently expanded into Canada. And, I think the plan for this year, Q4, is expansion to the UK market, right? That's kind of the church. We look at we get a lot of traffic. We're just not available there yet. But so it's in our roadmap. But so going obviously international, there's real growth opportunity. We see that, but it obviously comes with all these challenges you have to think about. Can you share some of the other common challenges that you've seen that people face when branching out into some of these new markets?
Yeah, look, I think it's tempting to try and do everything domestically, right, from the US, but the reality is Europe is complicated, right? So, I mean, the first point is leverage, a resource from a contact that is physically in Europe, right? Because not everybody knows, take, for example, that Europe has had challenges recently where the biggest kind of domestic market, the UK, has left the European Union and is therefore, after going through a process called Brexit, which, is not without its consequences. It means that London is no longer as attractive a venue for American companies as it once was 2 or 3 years ago, because, that's, that relationship is still very fraught, right? I'm based in London, but I'm from Ireland, so I get to wear two hats, and I can see that there's friction, there's tension, there's implications beginning to arise that not everybody's thinking about. So I guess my first point is recognize that you can get insights from people in Europe that can help shape your decisions. There's no doubt the UK is the second biggest market, but it trades in sterling, whereas most of the rest of Europe trades in the euro, right? So it's a different currency straight away. So I think there's a case of just being aware that even though the UK may be the biggest market from a kind of numbers point of view, you'll find that there's a playbook that involves a lot of companies with either Netherlands being Amsterdam or Dublin, Ireland, where they're serving the UK from those countries. So if you look at this sort of established tech companies, many of them have their sort of first boots on the ground in places like Dublin. And then the final point is that there are agencies and government agencies. The IDA is one. UKTI would be the UK version, where they are very active in the US. So they're often the best port of call to try and get some insights into the market. But I guess the macro is look at your Google Analytics to start seeing where the traffic is coming from. Then layer on top of that, where is the closed win business coming from Europe? And then kind of decide, do you need boots on the ground or can you service it sort of remotely? If you do think that you need boots on the ground, then recognize that it is nuanced. And much as I love my time in London and I'm continuing to live here, Brexit unfortunately has created an extra layer of complexity that many not be aware of. So you need the local input to navigate some of these challenges.
Mm-hmm. So do you recommend typically that, say boots on the ground, is that hiring somebody, finding some kind of consultancy, or like, for example, we're working with a company based out of France and they've done, quite well there. I think they've gone close to 5 million ARR. And I think last year they recently expanded into the US market, and the CEO actually moved down to Atlanta. He's spending time there and he's growing into that market. And, that's, showing for investors and all that, which, seems to be, working. But do you find that that's always necessary?
It's a great point, Akil. And this is where I think there's a difference between European companies heading west to the US and looking at it from the other way. And it's not a like-for-like game, right? So the reality is that the US is by far the biggest, B2B SaaS market that there is, right? So if you're a European startup with decent traction, the lever up that gets you the scale is definitely the US play. And it also means, with your example, I would be advocating that someone from the senior leadership team would move across. I don't think it's the same coming the other way, because the reality is that, from a European perspective, the uplift and scale up and going west is significant. Coming back this way, it's not as significant. So I don't think you need the kind of C-suite, all decamping to Europe. But I would suggest, one of the senior leaders considers it if they feel that, that the need is there. But I guess the next kind of point is to go back to, if it's the sales operation or sales function, does that need field sales, boots on the ground, and so that model, or can it be sold through, people on demos and discovery calls who could be working remotely from Ireland or the UK? And then the other thing is that you can, there is a very well-established model in Europe where you would outsource maybe some of the operation functions. So call centers may often be based in Europe, where they are actually outsourced fully. And the agents working in these companies have the playbooks of the parent company back in the US, but they're not full-time employees. So you get the kind of scale up and the leverage without the associated fixed costs coming with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, I mean, if you're thinking about, expanding, let's say you're in the US, you're going to the UK, or you're thinking about, you said Amsterdam, Germany, there's a lot of things you have to consider. One is, hiring. So there's that kind of cultural perspective. There's how the clients interact with your product. Some want, more hands-on involvement versus, the US, they're okay with, one quick demo. Then there's regional differences. There's language. You mentioned currency. What are some other things you have to think about? Let's use those examples of countries. What are things you have to think about when expanding into there?
Yeah, I'd go back to the data, right? And as I said, the data can be, Google Analytics is a great source where you can kind of see the traffic from these different pockets. But, what you'll find is, let's say, take Ireland as an example, or the Netherlands. Both of those are very small countries, right? So they don't have big markets to sell into, but you tend to have a lot of talent there. And taking Ireland, which I know well, one of the things is a lot of the first wave of companies that landed from the US came to places like Ireland. So my home city in Ireland is a place called Cork. I think there's almost 5,000 people working in Apple there. Dell have a significant operation. You start going through the Facebooks of the world, the LinkedIn, the Google. So what you have is you've got a really rich talent pool of people that are working in these companies. So familiar with US culture, working in environments that have been trained up. Now, the slight difficulty for the rest of us working in B2B SaaS is there's kind of golden handcuffs with lots of these, right? Because they're being paid very, very well. But if you're looking, going back a tack to kind of look at selling in, there's small things you can get unstuck on. So, it's tempting for the sales function to be focused on things like competition in the market and pricing. But things like where the data resides can be something that can come up and come unstuck on, right? So, have you got servers in Europe because there's data privacy and data regulations that mean that could be making some buyers look at, European offerings instead because they say, look, I don't want my data going to the US because maybe it's sensitive or maybe, maybe they've got queries about it. So it is nuanced. That all said, what you will find is that European consumers will often turn to American companies. Like if I looked at my tech stack, it's overwhelmingly European, right? So, we kind of, I'm Irish, so I speak English as my first language in the UK, but most of the professionals in professional buyers in sort of C-suite roles across Europe, most of them will be speaking English anyway. They will be familiar with interfaces that are, essentially the interfaces of American software. So I'm not so worried about that. I think the one thing to kind of watch is, I'm not hugely gone on crazy localization, right? So, you can find certain people will want Spanish or Italian or Dutch or German versions. I tread caution going down that route.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work, and you don't know if the results are worth the effort, is what you're saying, right?
Well, this is it, right? And there's lots of hidden costs that you don't even envisage, right? So you can all of a sudden start getting random, queries related to the software stack in native languages, and you may not have coverage on it, and demand may not be as strong as you think. You might have one or two people that are really vocal about there'll be a huge market opportunity if you translate it into a different language. Again, from experience, I've seen even traffic where we've done Spanish and Italian versions of the site, and they just don't get the traction that you get. Now, again, look, it goes back to resourcing. If your resourcing is fairly abundant and you're Series C and you've got huge checkbooks, go for it. Go and do all your translations into different languages. But for most, I'd issue caution and say, for the most part, you get a fairly far way along with your kind of core application. And what you might find is that there are some European competitors that's their basis for positioning, right? They're offering some features or languages for their own domestic markets, and let them have it, right? I just think that the ROI may not be there, and therefore it's not the best decision.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Ireland, right? And you mentioned Apple and all these big players who moved there. I think that was more for tax loophole that they're inviting, but I think they're trying to find a way to get over that, and I think that's going to be short lived. But anyways,
well, actually, I can that's actually a great point, but it's probably not that accurate, right?
No?
So
Okay.
No, because the reality is that the first tranche that kind of went there, go back to the Dell when they first in Apple. It wasn't the primary motivation. So a couple of things. Ireland is geography wise is pretty close to the US. It's 5 hours, across. Culturally, it's very similar. It's got a very strong education ethos. So there's a fairly high, workforce. Sorry, a highly qualified workforce. It feels like culturally, it feels quite similar. Obviously, English is the major language there, and yes, there was definitely some benefits around the tax system. They're gone now, but actually, the fact that they're gone hasn't really impacted. It's not like there's a flight of people leaving, and in fact, if anything, Ireland continues to, grow significantly and grow on kind of a trajectory that's, far in excess of everywhere else in Europe. Again, though, it's on a small population base, right? You're talking around 5 million. It's not like it's 300 million, right? So it's
sure.
It's all relative.
Yeah. Oh, good to know. And about the point you mentioned, right? Where, like you said, there's these people who are players in their space. For example, like we looked at this SEO tool that was just dominating in Germany. Everything was in Dutch and German, and they're doing really well. But there's a lot of if you try to compete with the big guys like the SEMrush and the Ahrefs, I mean, it's going to be hard. If they try to come to the market, they have to think about, right? Like you said, if you're just going to translate your app or just your website, I don't think that's enough, right? Like if you have the resources, you have to do all out, right? Like you have to do the proper keyword research, have a team, expansion. It needs a lot more investment of your time and planning versus just a simple website, right?
Right, and like let's look at the numbers, right? So let's say if you bring English into play, you've got obviously Canada, you've got Ireland, you've got the UK, you've got Australia, you've got South Africa, you've got New Zealand. All of a sudden that English pool of speakers is pretty significant. But then I kind of go back to the other point is that, most B2B SaaS applications are for an audience that is, English is probably the second language for most of these. So actually, most of them are as fluent as you and I, right? So again, I'm talking buyer personas. It might be different if you're targeting a different demographic, but let's assume you're targeting a professional demographic that's purchasing software. By and large, they're going to be speaking English. So I think you can make the false jump into localization thinking that there'll be a significant uplift because one or two people are vocal about it. All I'm saying is from experience, it comes with a heavy cost, and I don't think you get the upside. But maybe that's me. I do speak a little bit of French, so it's not as if I'm wedded to English as my only language. And I did German in school, so it's not as if I'm biased about it. But I'm saying that the data that I've seen and the kind of the analysis that I've looked at means that the upside is just not there in terms of the cost because a lot of the cost is hidden. And we got simple things like Google Translate is now improving and kind of you can have hacks with that as well, right?
Exactly. I mean, one big market we kind of missed, and we've seen that, attracts a lot of traffic that you don't expect is, India, for example, right? And most of those buyers are going to come in and are going to come in on English as well. Is there any other kind of, things you have to think about on the global level that you need to maybe custom build into your platform, when you're designing for a specific region and expansion, or is language just, the main one you want to think about?
Yeah, I mean, look, currency is one to just watch because you can get unstuck there if you're trying to do, $100 equals 100 euros equals 100 sterling, right? It's not, right? It doesn't equate like that. So you need to be watching that because otherwise you're getting this price arbitrage where people are giving out because why is it so much more, expensive in Europe relative to the US, right? So you kind of got to watch the currency thing. And look, it's hard. The other thing with SaaS, right, it's hard to make, generalizations for every vertical or for every horizontal application. Obviously, there could be legal issues mean that you have to have slightly different adoptions. But look, by and large, the whole point of SaaS, right, is that the unit economics are favorable, but it's kind of, they're favorable to the point where you don't really want to be doing almost like bespoke development. I think that's where you kind of want to avoid that. You really want to be doing a fantastic product that meets the needs of clearly defined personas. And then you're going to have to front load a lot of cost into sales and marketing to kind of generate the leads in the volume of business to pay off, obviously, as the SaaS revenue comes in the years to come. So I'm not a huge fan of too much bespoke development because, again, I think it takes you away from a cleaner unit economics point. And I think there's often hidden costs that kind of come back to roost 2 or 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road when you can find language issues or you can find support tickets coming in or things that get broken because you can't really maintain too many code bases.
Yeah, makes sense. And I know another point that, with work with agility, one thing you do well is you work as an interim CMO with some B2B SaaS companies and you help them build their lead generation pipeline, the revenues, Can you talk about a little bit, what does your typical playbook look like? And have you seen, any differences on what's worked best in the US and the European market, and if there's any differences in the US market when you're working with the SaaS companies?
Yeah, so a couple of questions baked in there. So if I don't get them in, come back to me. But I guess the main difference that sort of means that there are plenty of freelance external CMOs like me is in Europe is that it's a much more resource constrained environment is the first thing, right? So by that I mean is that we don't have the maturity of SaaS that you have in the US. We haven't probably had the full cycle of people go through the scale up journey, exit, and then come back around for round two. So there's definitely issues around the kind of the environment, right? And I guess to elaborate on that is, there's not quite the same deep pockets. So, we might do a seed or Series A round, let's say of $1 million. You might do 10 million, right? So there's a real resource constraint sort of sense for European SaaS compared to what I would perceive as resource abundance in the US. So that kind of means it's those two factors, right? The kind of lack of people that have gone through the experience of doing the scale up and coming out the other side means it's a tough hiring, pool because you don't have the 150K, 200K checks to be writing to fill out your C-suite because you don't have the budget, and you probably don't have the same caliber of execs that you get in the US. So it creates this opportunity for people like me that are sort of saying, okay, well, you don't need a full-time CMO because maybe you're around the Series A mark and wait till your Series B to fill the role. But maybe you are going to need some strategic input because otherwise you're hiring people that are marketing managers or digital marketing managers that don't have B2P and B2B and SaaS, and they don't have the track record. So that's kind of why there are roles for people like me, maybe more so than the US. In terms of the playbook, I guess, look, firstly, we take a lot of our lessons from the US, right? So we probably follow the same playbooks as most of your audience, right? And resourcing is always key, right? The playbook will vary depending on resourcing. Resourcing obviously means budget, but it also means execution capability in terms of people. But, the main pillars of key are typically paid acquisition. And of course, Google is the only show in town from a browser point of view in many countries in Europe. You might extend paid acquisition into LinkedIn, where you're using that as a sort of lead gen for more softer lead gen. And by that, I mean almost like white paper downloads and promote content. You do the content play, which is very much the organic, the keyword. And you mentioned SEM, Rush, and Ahrefs earlier. So you're kind of using those tools. But of course, content is getting more challenging, right? Because we're all drowning in content first and foremost. But secondly, you got a monopoly provider in Google that sort of would rather you paid for placement, right? So you can see over the years, you're now getting less and less real estate on page one. It's mostly paid, but you still will do content. That's sort of the second pillar. And then outbound is the third, where you're using, agencies, or you're doing it in-house to just try and spike demand from that. So they're the kind of three main pillars around lead gen. And then, of course, you're doing things like brand awareness, and you might do PR, and you might do events, and you might do webinars. So the playbook is essentially the same. I'm going to pause there because I've given you a lot of content. Do you want to jump in on any of those, or do you want me to keep going in other areas?
I think that makes sense. So, I mean, like you said, resources are constrained as hiring as a CMO. Maybe you have to think about, how you want to invest it, but it's an important role. Now, if you have a CMO, or let's say you're a CEO in the US, and you're maybe not moving to Europe, but you want to expand into a market there, and you want to hire a team there, right? I mean, that's important. How do you suggest them? Where or how do you help find great talent, and then building the right team to help them scale into that new market? Do you have any thoughts there that you could share?
Yeah. Again, look, there's a couple of points to make. I mean, first of all, there's definitely some managing expectations. It's a challenging hiring environment, right? So particularly for most B2B SaaS companies where they don't have huge brand recognition, right? Even if you hit a Series B, we're seduced by the unicorns, but many and most B2B SaaS companies don't have the brand awareness. So that's definitely a challenge, right? The other kind of thing linked to that is, the market to sort of source candidates. You would definitely be looking at using recruiters. But again, it's a very, very fragmented market, so it can be challenging to find, good recruiters. But what I would say is I would use boutique specialists that are B2B SaaS orientated rather than broader digital marketing. I think you are now beginning to see certain recruiters go into verticals. So, there's one called Commel that's related to Notion Capital, which is a big B2B SaaS investor here in the UK. They're an example of a boutique B2B SaaS company. But then what I would say is this freelance model is quite common in the UK and Ireland in particular, where there's a bit of people at my kind of level whereby, they don't want all their eggs in one basket. They've done the head of marketing or they've done the CFO role. They're probably working remotely. They're interested in supporting companies, and they can probably provide some initial support around making some fast track decisions. So I kind of go back to my kind of key point, which is try to identify a couple of people. Where do you find them? I guess, one way is looking at perhaps some of the C-suite that may have contacts from Europe that they've worked with, right? So I'd kind of use your Rolodex, use your LinkedIn first level connections. I think that's kind of key. Using the personal contact is definitely where I'd recommend going first. And that's a really great starting point. But also some of these agencies that I mentioned. So the IDA, and you can put it in the show notes afterwards, which is the Irish Development Agency, will have a very big presence, particularly in the West Coast in the US. And they're a mine of information. And UKTI, again, would be similar. That's the UK body. I'm not as familiar with the bodies of other countries like, let's say, the Netherlands and Germany. But again, those two, Ireland and UK, those government bodies would be a very good source of, and they have actually people physically on the West Coast in the major cities that can sort of help make introductions to kind of get the ball rolling.
So if I'm a SaaS company based in the US, I come to you and say, hey, Alan, help me expand into the Ireland, into this market here. We're going to hire you as an interim CMO and, build out our team. We need some content marketers. We need some paid specialists. I'm assuming you have some people you've worked with and you recommend, and you'd help them build that team. But then they might get to a point, right? So, okay, so glad you clarified that. But they might get to a point where it's like, okay, thanks for, you've helped us grow. We've now raised our Series C, and we want to hire a full-time CMO role. Now, you're kind of in that position. It's like, okay, we need some, in a way to replace you because you don't want to be locked in, be full-time. How do you help them make that transition to hire somebody full-time? And what can they expect to pay? What are the kind of going salaries for a full-time experienced, CMO in the market today?
Yeah. So look, I'm like a SaaS model myself, right? I do get churned out. And in some ways that's a success factor because, there's a growth journey that I want to take the clients on. And, to your point, one of the motivations that got me doing what I did is I wanted to de-risk and not have all my eggs in one basket because, the tenure for most CMOs and VC-backed B2B SaaS companies is probably a couple of years, right? They're fairly demanding roles and quite challenging. So, so for me, it's a natural transition for most. And in fact, I did it with one of my clients about a year ago, and I was very much integral to that transition. So I could see that the growth was to the point where we did need a full-time CMO. I essentially was involved in the hiring process. I was involved in the creation of the job spec. And my playbook was very much one of, show me, don't tell me, because sales and marketing hires, particularly senior ones, are very difficult, right? Because marketers can market themselves well. Salespeople can sell themselves well. So, I'll often look for what I call the digital footprint that I can Google the people and see, okay, am I seeing them on podcasts? Are they writing blog content? Can I see evidence of them writing blogs? Can I see their digital footprint? Are they attending SaaS Stock, which is the big event in Europe? But what I would say, just a couple of words of caution, is you won't find that many that will have gone on the scale-up Series B, C, D kind of growth journey. There's just not huge numbers of them out there, right? So you may have to make a concession on that where you are, which is a couple of implications. So one is you may want to be hiring someone that's, that has not had the kind of resourcing team size or the budgets that you want to put into Europe. So, but the flip side is that maybe they're only doing execution on behalf of the CMO, the head CMO that's back in the States, right? So maybe the role is really more of a delivery arm or an execution arm, in which case you probably don't need, because you can't really run two CMOs in parallel. So maybe the playbook really is you've got your CMO in the States, but really you're looking for a senior marketing lead in Europe, but they are an order taker or an execution arm instead, which probably changes the dynamic, a small bit. Then in terms of what you'd expect to pay, again, the range will be quite wide, but I suspect around the $100,000 is probably a good starting point. And then it will veer up or down depending on the levels of experience.
Yeah, that's what I figure. I've seen some even in the US, some for senior one, you'll pay up, up to, you're looking at closer to 300K. So yeah, they're not easy to find, right? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think I'd say the salaries are probably higher in the US, right? So you probably wouldn't be paying the same amount. But I kind of go back to the point, that if the European SaaS lead is largely, or the marketing lead, Akhil, is largely execution and maybe doing a bit of localization, it's a slightly different skill set. It's not C-suite strategic, I'm sitting at the top table, because then it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's different when you're managing the budget and having to allocate it and be accountable, right? Versus just doing the execution. That's what you.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how I would think of that. But again, have you had any of your portfolio clients have had these challenges, or how they looked at it, or?
We typically, that's kind of how we work with them, kind of more acting of a, lead CMO, kind of CMO fractional role. We haven't had to hire, but, we've talked to people, that like, for example, looking to hire in the US, and that's what they said, right? Like typically they're looking for, a good person, close to 250, 300, right? So it's definitely not cheap compared to Europe, right?
Yeah, and of course, like the other thing to bear in mind is depending on where you're on your journey, different skill sets are needed, right? So I'd argue, in the early days, you're not going to pay that kind of money, but you're looking for more of a product marketing specialist, right? So they got to be really validating the assumptions and talking to customers and sort of doing all that good stuff. As you kind of get out of that sort of product market fit piece into the next piece, you're looking at very much someone that's hard on lead gen and sort of that's the kind of core skill. And then almost when you start hitting the kind of Series C level, you're almost looking at the brand awareness and some of the strategic stuff. So again, it depends where on the journey, but they are different skill sets, which kind of plays back to why the tenure can be, quite short in many of these roles. And actually, there's a great article by Tom Tungus, who's a leading US VC that writes on B2B SaaS, and he'll often talk about the biggest mishire in B2B SaaS is the first marketing hire, where you hire for growth when really you need a product marketing person to really validate the assumptions and not try to get into sales mode too quickly.
Yeah, that's right. You're completely right. Cool. This has been really good. I really appreciate you sharing all these insights. I think our audience will enjoy it. So Alan, I want to shift gears here and move towards the fun part of the interview, which is the rapid fire kind of more personal question. So you ready to roll for that?
Sounds good, Akhil. Throw them at me.
All right, let's do this. All right. What's one activity you enjoy doing outside of work that gets you into flow state?
Yeah, so I'm a rugby coach. So rugby isn't that well known, probably well known on the coast, right, on the East Coast, and particularly around Boston and New York. But I'm a rugby coach over here and coaching under 12s. So, it's gets me out in the fresh air. It's all about teamwork and camaraderie and the values of the game and the skills. So I do enjoy that, I must say. It's a nice break away from the desk.
Nice. Do you still get your physical tackles in there, or are you just, pointing people to get hit?
I wish, yeah. With 12-year-olds, you definitely don't want to be tackling them. So no, it's a bit of aerobic on running around the pitch with a whistle and shouting, but that's about it, Akhil.
Nice. I love it. What was your vision when you first started working, when you started, building work with agility, and how has that evolved over time to what it is today?
Yeah, I mean, the vision was I like helping people, right? So that's kind of in my DNA, and I sort of felt actually being able to help people, it was important, right? Secondly, I had a significant amount of experience in B2B SaaS, and I go back to the context earlier in that, there isn't a huge amount. I mean, it grows every year, of course, but it's still a relatively new industry sector. I mean, I worked in software when there was a 56K dial-up, right, where you had to connect to the web through an AOL or a free serve disk, right? I remember selling software in boxes of software in retail stores. So I've kind of been on the journey, so I could see that I had kind of picked up a lot of knowledge over the years. And look, part of it was also this frustration with the tenure. No matter how good you were doing in the role, SaaS companies are long-term games, and you're probably never going to get to stay on the 10 years of the journey, right? So you kind of end up in this weird cycle where you're churned out of roles after a couple of years, which again is quite unsettling, and you don't have job security. And so they were some of the motivations. And I guess I didn't have a grandiose vision, right? So I guess if I was critiquing where I've got to is, I didn't want to build a huge agency, right? My passion is SaaS, so I didn't want to be managing lots of people, which has meant I haven't scaled and grown the business like I probably could do or would do, right? So I tend to use lots of partners that I, use to bring in, but I haven't taken it on a huge growth trajectory. But part of that is not playing the lifestyle card, but I have a young family, and I'm recognizing that there's a balance to everything, right? So I really enjoy what I do. Is there a scale up at some point? There absolutely is, and I will undoubtedly do my own SaaS play at some point. But I'd rather kind of not scale an agency. I'd rather pick my time, come out with a B2B SaaS company myself, and then concentrate all my energies on that. And the kind of final point in that is I think there's a real emergence of what I call vertical B2B SaaS. So the first tranche of SaaS was very much horizontal, like accountancy software or expense management, where you could, span lots of industries. I think now you're beginning to see the emergence of vertical niche SaaS opportunities, which they're slightly different playbook. You probably don't need the same level of investment. Your growth ambitions are probably different. You don't need big VC backing. So I think I'll carve out a vertical SaaS play myself at some point, and that's where I'll get to.
Nice. Did you say you'd have a niche that or a vertical where you're better at, or your industry? Like, for example, us. Seems like, marketing tech is where we're at. I mean, we have the expertise there, and we get a lot of attraction, and people are interested in working with us or selling to us, or, getting investment, and because, it just seems like what we're good at. But, if we went into, like fintech, as, we probably wouldn't be as familiar as, maybe somebody like you. So what would you say your areas you're strongest at?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. So, again, I've been fortunate, right, that by going down this model, I've been exposed to a whole range of different industries. So if I look at my current portfolio base, one is a leading cybersecurity company that's transitioning away from kind of professional services through to, a SaaS play. Another one is a leading procurement company. So it's a sourcing optimization company that's using artificial intelligence. I've got another one that's in performance management. So actually, I span lots of areas. I probably don't have a great answer for you. I probably do need to kind of verticalize. I guess the marketing tech one, which you quite rightly point out, is the one that I would probably be most focused on, particularly because I'm using a lot of these tools. So, tools like you referenced earlier, SEMrush and Ahrefs, they're really, really brilliant tools. So I think that will be my area of specialism. But sometimes I probably don't need to be the deep domain experts, because by dint of the fractional CMO role, I work best when there's execution capability that needs to be led. So when there's people in the team that that are the domain experts, but just need some sort of strategic direction. So yeah, not my best answer for you, but a broad mix, but definitely marketing will probably be the narrower one.
It makes sense. Alan, what's one piece of advice you wish you had known and would tell your 25-year-old self?
Yeah, you stumped me on. I was thinking about this because you had mentioned this previously, or you had sent me the question, and I guess I was trying to play back to when I was 25, right? And that's quite 20 years ago, right? So it was some time ago, and look, it was a very different world there. I was back, in banking at the time, working in financial services. My background was economics and marketing. I just gone to business school. I think when I reflect back, I made a career move into software, which I've really loved. But actually, on reflection, I didn't take a lot of counsel on that move. So the kind of transition to software was serendipitous that software has kind of gone like this. But, I left a blue chip. Barclays, one of the biggest companies in the UK, with a very, strong career path and, very, major enterprise. And I jumped into a US subsidiary, which was a small startup essentially for software. And I guess it took me on a completely different path, but I probably didn't give it enough time in terms of thinking. So if I was to give myself advice, I'd say, definitely experiment in your early 20s, but try and get some outside counsel for someone to play through the implications of the decision, because I probably was seduced by a title and some salary when actually, I was completely taken on a different trajectory, which could have worked out pretty badly, right, if I backed the wrong horse. So,
right.
So that's the advice.
Nice. I like that. What are some of the biggest challenges you're currently facing in order to continue to grow work with agility? Meaning, what keeps you up at night these days?
Yeah, look, I think there's almost way too much for a marketing function, right? I touched on it earlier, right, where we're always very resource constrained, and prioritization is difficult. And on the flip side, there's always this desire for significant growth, but what's happened is there's been a collapse in the barriers to entry for SaaS startups. So all of a sudden, nearly every vertical I'm in is flooded with entrants. So, the landscape is almost arguably becoming more difficult because, one of the easy playbooks, of course, is for often American VC-backed companies to come in and not need to be profitable, right? They go, it's a winner takes all market. I can just, you go do the playbook that I talked about earlier, but, be happy to pay $50 a keyword, versus $5, which we're targeting. So the bit that keeps me awake is that it's sort of, you can be really on top of your game, but the context can be a very challenging one. So I guess, growth will always be there, and it's what keeps me awake. Are we growing my client base? Are they growing fast enough? And most will always want to be growing faster, but often the context of one is it's challenging. So how do you keep ahead of the game? So they're the things that kind of keep me awake, I guess.
Yeah, makes sense. Who or what are some of the best 3 resources? This can be books, mentors, or people you follow the space who you'd say been the most instrumental to your success over these last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably been weak on mentorship. Again, if I personally reflected on my journey, I haven't really engaged with having a mentor, right? I've mentored lots of people, but I haven't really engaged with having a mentor myself. So that's definitely something I should have done, right? So I get that's a shortfall. In terms of, I devour content. I think you have to if you're working in B2B SaaS. So, I really like the work of people like David Scott. So he's on a Matrix in Boston. He writes some really interesting content. Tom Tungus, I alluded to him earlier, another great writer. Mark Suster, again, another VC from Upfront, writes both sides of the table. Again, a prolific writer. All of those have probably petered off. They're not writing as much as they used to, but some of their early stuff was phenomenal. And then Avanish, I don't know if you know Avanish Kaushik of Occam's Razor. I'm signed up to his, monthly newsletter. It's a phenomenal resource. So they're my kind of go-to resources when I want to kind of keep in touch of what's going on. I guess the thing is, there's a heavy male bias there. I'm aware of that. There's a heavy US bias there. I'm aware of that. That's the landscape, right? I'm always happy to diversify, and if there's others that I should be reading. I mean, I like April Dunford, who's obviously female and writes about positioning and has got some great stuff. So there's some of the people that I like to read.
Cool. Well, we'll add those people to our show notes and their links to their resources if people want to check out. Alan, what does success mean to you today? Whether that's personally, business, financial, life, there's no right answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a number of things, right? Health. It starts getting really high up the chart as you started getting a bit older, right? You take it for granted at your 20s, but as you get older, you kind of you start trying to do your best to try and improve that, right? That's success, right? If you're healthy and happy, I think they're the primary motivators. So that to me, they become bigger. So that brings in family and friends is kind of also on a same level. So there's some of the metrics. So there's no doubt it changes as you get older. And I think there are some of the things that I think are success now. Whereas in your earlier years, I think there's definitely this kind of peer comparison and beat the neighbor. And I think that's, not healthy. And it goes on a lot. But as you kind of get older and a little bit wiser, you realize that, success isn't something you measure by comparing against your neighbor. In fact, that's the worst thing you should do. Success needs to be more intrinsic and sort of motivated by things that make you happy without worrying about others.
Exactly. Love it. It's for yourself, not for others. Nice. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you jumping on the show today. There's lots of insights for people to learn. Where can SaaS founders listening in who want to get in touch with you, learn more about you and your company if they want to chat? Where's the best place to get in touch?
Yeah, so my website is Work with Agility. So I think you'll spell it out in the show notes. The spelling is fairly straightforward, but Work with Agility. If you Google Alan Gleeson, I think I've done a good job on SEO, so I think you'll find me pretty easily. So Gleeson. So I pretty much show up for that as well.
Okay, awesome. Workwithagility.com. If you guys want to say hi to Alan, make sure to reach out to him. Thank you so much once again, Alan. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much, Akil. I've enjoyed chatting to you.
Cheers. Thank you all for watching this episode and joining SaaS District today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for future episodes where we interview top leaders in the SaaS industry. If you're a SaaS company looking to grow and unlock the true value of your business, get in touch with us at Horizon Capital, and myself or one of our consultants will provide a free assessment to help you get there and hit your goals. If you have any feedback or suggestions for this podcast, please comment down below and help us improve our content for you all. Thanks again, and see you on the next one.